of the questions I get a lot is why vintage watches, right? Are they reliable? Are they something that should be babied and cared for in a very pampering manner? And what I equate this to is, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are antiques and a lot of things that are vintage that you have to be more cautious with, right? You can't drive a classic car like you would a modern car. I mean, that's I think can be said about most antique appliances, whatever. But the cool thing about these watches that are made in that 60s and 70s era was that they were never meant to be pampered. A lot of the watches like the Submariner and the GMT, they came about as a result of a need for a specific purpose. So in the case of the GMT, it was the first time in history where commercial flight was happening at a regular rate and at a speed in which the pilots were experiencing jet lag and crossing multiple time zones. So Pan Am Airlines at the time reached out to Rolex to co-develop a tool that will allow pilots to be able to tell multiple time zones. Therefore, the GMT was thus created. So these things were never built and drawn up by marketing men or by a room of analysts that said, you know what, 44 millimeter watches were really in this year, and we think 45 is going to be really big next year. They were thought up with a single purpose, and that it was the original app or application, right? So these tools that were then created became overly built. No one bought a Rolex and then immediately thought, well, what are they going to buy next year? They tried to create a watch that was as perfect and as good of a quality that will last a lifetime. So the life cycle of a watch, you're talking in terms of lives as opposed to a quarter, a season, a year, et cetera, which is, I think, most manufacturers in this day and age that's the timeline that they're operating in. And so I've sold watches to different customers, and I've seen some that treat them like, you know what, this is their most prized possession, and they wipe them with a diaper every night, to customers that don't realize they have a $15,000 watch on and just go about the day. And I think it's somewhere in between for me, where I recognize that there is a lot of value in this watch, and there's perceived resale value has risen dramatically over the years. But at the same time, I do want to honor the way that the purpose of what this watch is. It was overly engineered, overly built, and I don't want to have to think throughout my day, oh, did I nick the door, or did I scratch the bezel? To me, that patina and that wear is also part of the charm and allure of a vintage piece. There are people that want an all perfect new old stock watch that's been in a time capsule for 50, 60 years. And you will always have a collector out there that's looking for those types of watches, just like there are people that are looking for barnyard finds, untouched, Ferrari Dinos. But I don't want to feel restricted where I have this mint watch that now I feel guilty of wearing. Part of the charm and a lot of the collectors that are in this vintage space, part of the charm of getting a scratch or nick is also adding your own story to it. You kind of see and progress with the watch, and it's ever changing. And that's also part of the charm, is that when these watches were created, they look so dramatically different from what they are today. 1969 GMT, if you took 10 of them that were made that same month, that's by the same person, and you track those for the next 50 years, a lot of those watches are going to look dramatically different because of the people that have worn them. And that has a large effect in terms of what the dial looks like, the lume, the bezel, depending on how much exposure to UV light, how often the person wore it swimming, or just the way that they used it. A lot of people, I think, would compare these vintage pieces to automobiles. But I like to akin them to, I think they're more similar to wine. They are almost a living, decaying item. And over time, its flavor profile, its look, its aesthetic is going to change over time. And some of that can be accelerated in terms of how much you use the watch. or how much you don't use the watch. I mean, we've heard there's opposing sides to this, but watches that were discovered in a desk drawer without much exposure to UV light, the lume and the plots on the lume look a little bit darker. So there's all these different ways to wear it, and there's no one way to wear it where it's like guaranteed to look a certain way. So to me, it's an ever-evolving or almost organic-like substance, especially when you're dealing with radioactive substances, radium, tritium, etc. And I think that's also lends itself to, this is something that does not come out of a catalog. It did originally, but this is not something that you can go to the store and say, you know what, I want to find a birth year GMT 1675, super fat font. It has to have denim navy colors on the bezel, and I want like more of like a salmon copperish tone on the red part. And it's not a catalog. It's not a buffet where you pick and choose. To find the piece that you're dreaming of that has the right look for you takes not only money, it takes a community of people, a wealth of knowledge to be able to share that and be able to authenticate and confirm, hey, this watch has the correct bezel. This is the type of dial that's supposed to sit within this serial range. And the third most valuable thing is you need a bit of luck. And this is what is so different and I think so meaningful about purchasing a vintage watch that you've been searching for, as opposed to going to a mall, signing up for a waitlisted Daytona and hoping that you kiss enough ass to get on the good side of an associate to sell you and accelerate you up the wait list. That's never really been a pleasurable buying experience, I'm sure. And maybe it is for those that actually receive those GMTs and Daytonas brand new from the dealer. But I think for the most of us, we don't want to be forced to buy watches we don't necessarily love just to get on the good side of a dealer so that we could potentially one day purchase the watch we want. So what does my typical customer profile look like? And I think this is very fascinating to me because I get people from all different types of backgrounds looking for either their first vintage watch, or this is their 20th Submariner that they're looking to collect. And it's cool seeing that there's such a younger generation that's really getting into this. And a part of that I think is the bombardment of all the marketing and channels that are available to people, my demographic and younger, where I think you get almost inundated with too much information. We don't want to be told, hey, this is the new watch to wear, or this is, you need to buy these jeans, or it's like we're constantly getting flooded with that. So it's nice to take a step back and figure out, hey, what makes sense to me? What products were not made in that the same ethos and the same kind of marketing budget. I think Rolex is a huge brand that has worldwide presence. And so there's automatically an attraction to success and a celebratory feel for the watch. But the type of people that are getting into it are looking for something a little bit more understated, right? I've been in airports, I've been in restaurants where people tap me on the shoulder and say, that's a very cool watch. But that's not the reason why I wear it, right? And those experiences are far and few between from my friends that are wearing APs and huge diamond encrusted watches. I think the audience that are receptive, that have the right kind of frequency to like pick up on these older obscure watches, are the same type of people that kind of appreciate the craftsmanship and the story that goes along with it. A watch that is that has that kind of legacy and history and that automatic recognition, like a GMT. People seeing something that's a matte dial with yellow plots, they're like, I recognize that watch, but how come it looks different? And it's always a great conversation starter. Or someone will come up and say, hey, I think my dad has that watch, right? Or like, is that a Pepsi GMT? Is that, and then some people even go further, like, hey, that's a cool gilt dial you have there. And of course, you just automatically have that connection. You're like, okay, this guy must know what he's talking about, because 99% of the population won't pick up on that this is anything special, right? I have people that are C-suite executives that love getting into these. They love, chatting with their friends about it, and going into meetings where it's not super flashy. You don't feel like you're making someone else feel uncomfortable with, a very flashy watch, or even if it's a gold watch. A vintage gold piece, just for whatever reason, seems way more blue collar than, a modern ceramic Daytona. I think there's a charm in it because it doesn't feel like, this is something that I went and splurged on. Sometimes it feels like this was handed down, or it was something that was meaningful and has a story. And a lot of the cases, these watches that we find and we procure, they have these meaningful inscriptions. They have these meaningful stories that are tied to them. And we try to do it justice by asking as many questions as we can about where the person found the watch, why they're getting rid of it, what was the background of the owner that had it. Because the provenance of it, and it doesn't have to be anyone famous like a Paul Newman type character. I think just the honesty of where this watch came from, how it was worn, why are there so many scratches on it, why was the hand replaced, and this culmination and aggregation of history and stories should go along with watches that we sell. And we make every effort to try to collect this, because not only is it interesting to us, we think it's kind of cool to see, inscription for a year of a watch and find out what was going on during that year in that person's life. I think there's two schools of thought. Some people are very, very big into the history and trying to figure out, where these watches came from. Other people just don't care. They want to wear something vintage and they want to add their own story to it. There is no right or wrong, but we figure we try to provide as much information to the next owner so that they may decide to, carry the story or carry the legacy or add their own story and history to the watch. How do you pick a vintage watch? I think there's plenty of places to start. And jumping into watches in general, I think is a little bit intimidating. There's so many different brands. There's so many different types of watches. Where do you really start? And my take on that is you can only really answer that once you kind of figured out and narrowed down what is it that you really want. And that's a loaded question, right? It's very vast because, just because I collect vintage doesn't mean that there's no appreciation for modern watches. But I think collecting vintage, because it's not something easily referenced to a catalog, it takes a lot of due diligence. It takes a lot of homework. I can't tell you how many horror stories I've had of customers that are trying to trade in a watch, and they told me they bought this on eBay and they think it's worth this, and it turns out it's a service dial. It's got reloomed parts on it, the bezel service, or bezel maybe perhaps even fake. It's just not a watch that has been carefully preserved. And there's a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of things that can go wrong throughout that time. And I can't tell you how much it sucks to hear about these, because you're the one that has to deliver, or I'm the one that has to deliver that bad news to that person. You do take a lot of risk. And a lot of the times, people that are selling these watches on eBay or on the forums and on Craigslist, wherever you go look, even pawn shops, they don't know what they have. And so it's not even for the sake of dishonesty that they're misrepresenting the watch on purpose. They may not be able to tell, like, hey, this is how the watch came to me. I've been wearing it for 15 years. There's nothing wrong with it. But I think there's a lot of homework, and that's why I feel like the collecting side of this and the ownership side of this is so special, because not anyone that just walks in without any background on vintage watches can jump into it. right? Just because you have money doesn't mean you're not going to get burned. You can limit those chances by working with dealers and reputable sellers that have a history of selling these watches. I think that's definitely a good start if you are jumping into it, because no one really will do the homework on a specific reference until you own your first piece of that reference. Like, for example, I got into the GMT as my third watch, the reference 1675. And before buying that watch, I knew there were different variations. I knew there were different color inserts for it, but I trusted who I was buying from. And he led me into a great piece. And once I got that piece, I started to pick out all the small differences. Oh, the middle prong of the letter E in Rolex is longer for the Mark I. Oh, the Mark II and the L, the L vertical part is a little bit thicker. All these little small differences became very, very bold and very apparent to me. And once I had that in my mind, then I really got granular, going an inch wide and a mile deep into that specific reference. So I think that's a great place to start, is picking out a piece that visually you're attracted to, doing at least a little bit of legwork and understanding the types of differences between the models of Rolex, 1675s and the 16750, matte dials versus white gold surround dial, glossy dials, to going way back to early gilt dials. Figuring out, you know what, this is my price range and this is where I'm going to be focusing my attention on. That's a great way to start. I think from there, you can then start having this encyclopedia in your head of kind of what things are supposed to look like. It's really hard to judge what a dial is supposed to look like just going through pictures online or combing through pictures in books. There is a presence to some of these watches that can only be translated through holding the piece in your hands and seeing how the relation it is to the rest of the watch. That's something that's almost indescribable. When I first got into it, I was asking my friend that sold me this watch, hey, how can you tell that this is a fat font insert versus a super fat font? Or how can you tell that this is a service insert versus, and it's really hard to describe. It's like basically describing like how can you tell a counterfeit painting of Picasso to someone that just got into the collecting art, right? You could describe all these things that you look for. And if you did it through pictures and you did it through magnification, that's certainly one way of doing it. But having it side by side in person, it's kind of like really being able to see the watch for what they are. And it's some of those things are very hard to describe just through pictures. So the other question I am often asked is, what makes this watch that looks almost exactly the same as this watch 30% more, 20% more, right? Like, how do you evaluate watches? How do you determine, hey, this one watch should be worth more than this? And I often describe this as a grocery list, right? When someone is looking to collect a Picasso or just any fine art piece, modern art, what have you, it's not enough. And it's even almost counterintuitive to go through a checklist and say, you know what? Okay, this watch has a fat insert. Yes. This watch has this shade of lume. Yes. And this watch is unpolished and has boxing papers. Therefore, it spits out a scientific calculation of what this watch is worth. True. Yes. A lot of those things do determine the value of a watch. But you don't look at a Picasso and say, this Picasso used 15 different acrylic colors and oils for this painting. And the canvas was actually manufactured by this one company. So it's not the sum of its parts. To look at a vintage watch and look at the sum of it is a bit like collecting art. You have to have an eye for it in the sense that it has to be aesthetically pleasing to you. At the end of the day, no matter what. Even if everyone thinks it's the most beautiful piece, 1675 in the world, if it doesn't speak to you as a collector, as an owner, as a dealer, how can you value the watch in that same shape? So you really have to understand what you like, what is pleasing to you, what you're acceptable with. And a lot of these watches that surface over the years, 40, 50 years, they're not preserved in time capsules. They're not preserved in Tupperware, stored away in a hermetically sealed bag. And, these things they were sold for maybe $200, $300 back in the day. So only through time and only through an understanding did these pieces start becoming more and more valuable. So people did not treat them as $20,000, $30,000 objects. So oftentimes you will have scratches. You'll have a piece that may have gone a bezel replaced over the course of its life. Not everything comes perfect. And to understand that means, as a collector and as a preserver of this hobby, sometimes it's also being able to search for the purely correct items that's supposed to belong to these watches. I've had clients that passed up amazing watches just because the loom pip on the insert was missing, or it was replaced, or for whatever reason the bezel did not match. And this is, I think, what is so interesting about this hobby, is to be a historian and to be able to catalog and reference. This is the right insert for this watch, or this is more aesthetically pleasing, and to me that's acceptable as well. There's, at the end of the day, there's no real right or wrong way to collect, but there are ways in which I think you can maximize your return and maximize your enjoyment with these watches. If you're going to be sitting around waiting for a watch to have every single item on your checklist, you're going to be passing up a lot of great watches. You're going to be passing up a lot of great opportunities to make that piece right. One of the questions I get a lot is, should I pick between a Submariner or a GMT? And one of my favorite references is both the 5513 Submariner and the 1675 GMT. Those two watches have such polarizing different feels in the way that you wear them. What I love about the 5513 is that it's the most quintessential vintage Rolex, recognizable vintage Rolex out there. I think everyone knows what a Submariner is. But to look at the 5513 with there being no date, everything's symmetrical, it always has this black insert into it. So it's very subdued. It's the type of watch that you would wear where you don't want to garner a lot of attention, but at the same time, you do want something iconic. And that, to me, is the definition of the 5513 Submariner. Juxtaposed to that, looking at the 1675, to me, that would be, if I could only have one watch to wear, that would be the watch. And part of the reason for my love for the 1675 is that on these vintage Rolex pieces, it's very hard to find the watches that were colorful. And the Pepsi GMT back in the day, especially with a nice fat font insert, those bezels and the inserts wear out differently as opposed to modern watches today. You'll see certain Pepsi inserts, they'll fade into more of a fuchsia color, like a purplish pink. And other ones will fade more ghost, they'll become very light, and others will still retain that same saturation. So you can get a lot of looks with the 1675. It's almost like having multiple watches, because you could quite honestly collect just the inserts and swap them out just to kind of get a different feel. You can have an all black insert, which is makes it look more like a Submariner, or you can get something like a fuchsia insert, which is very rare, but it's a very, very vibrant, unique color. Now, I would say that the 1675 is more versatile in that manner, but the 5513 Submariner, and taking that same philosophy of kind of collecting different inserts and swapping them out for different looks, the 5513 makes you focus more on the lume, the dial itself, because the only thing that presents off color would be the color of the luminescence plots. So if you have some that I think with like a orange pumpkin patina to it on the dial, and match it with something that is a fat font, ghost gray, faded out black, a ghost gray insert, there's a lot of contrast there. It's almost like an inverse of what a modern Submariner will look like today, which is very monochromatic, black and white. So I think playing with the colors and playing with, getting fun with it, not everything has to be correct, especially if you do have the original parts for it. You can collect, different inserts and get that versatility where instead of having 4 or 5 watches, just have one GMT or one 5513 Submariner and have 3 or 4 different color shades of inserts to mix and match with it.